Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
You ever wake up thinking you're in control of your life, only to find out someone ripped the rug right out from under you? That was me. One moment, I was standing at the edge of everything I had worked for, staring at the future I had built for myself, and the next it was gone like a cruel joke played by someone who never had to suffer the consequences. I remember that morning too well, the way the sun slanted through my bedroom blinds, the smell of fresh coffee brewing in the kitchen, the feeling of peace that lasted all of 2 minutes before I grabbed my phone and opened my banking app, expecting to see the savings I had spent years carefully stacking up. Instead, I saw a number that made my stomach drop so hard I thought I might be sick right there in my own bed. Zero. Not a cent left. Every single dollar, the nearly 80,000 I had worked myself into the ground to save, was gone like it had never even existed. My brain refused to process it at first. I blinked, refreshed the screen, checked my other accounts, even restarted my phone like some idiot who thought maybe technology had just decided to play a cruel prank on me. But no, it wasn't a glitch, and it wasn't a mistake. It was real. My hands were shaking when I opened my transaction history, and what I saw next made my entire body go numb. The withdrawals weren't random. They weren't the work of some hacker halfway across the world. They were all transfers, one after another, bleeding my account dry in just a matter of days. And the name on them? My mother. I don't even remember getting dressed. 1 second, I was staring at my screen, my vision tunneling, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts, and the next I was in my car, tearing down the street toward my mother's house. The whole drive, my brain was trying to make sense of it, to come up with some logical explanation, something that wasn't just outright theft. Maybe she had made a mistake. Maybe there was some emergency I didn't know about. Maybe she was planning to put it right back. But deep down, I already knew. I knew this wasn't an accident, and I knew exactly why she had done it. By the time I pulled into her driveway, my hands were clenched so tight around the steering wheel that my knuckles ached. I barely remembered slamming the car door, stomping up the front steps, and yanking the door open without even knocking. She was there, standing in the kitchen like nothing had happened, stirring sugar into her coffee, completely at ease. "Morning, sweetheart," she said, barely glancing at me. "You look like you've seen a ghost." It took everything in me not to explode right there. "Where is it?" My voice was low, shaking, barely controlled. She frowned, turning to face me fully. "Where's what?" "My money," I hissed, stepping closer, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode in my chest. "Where the hell is my money, Mom?" For a split second, something flashed in her eyes. Guilt, maybe, or hesitation. But then, just like that, it was gone, replaced by something so infuriatingly casual that I could have screamed. "Oh, that," she said, waving a hand like we were talking about loose change found in the couch cushions. "I took it out a few days ago. Danny needed it." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Danny. Of course it was Danny. My younger brother, the golden child, the one who had spent his entire life making mess after mess, always knowing that someone, usually me, would be there to clean it up. He had screwed up again, and once again, my mother had stepped in to save him. Only this time, she hadn't sacrificed her own money. She had sacrificed mine. "Are you kidding me?" My voice was rising now, the fury bubbling up so fast I could barely contain it. "You stole my money to bail him out? Do you have any idea what I went through to save that? Do you even care?" She sighed like I was the one being unreasonable. "Ethan, don't be dramatic. You'll be fine. You're smart. You're responsible. You always land on your feet." But Danny, he needed help, and I wasn't just going to stand by and do nothing. I stared at her, my pulse hammering in my ears. "You weren't going to stand by and do nothing?" I repeated, my voice dripping with disbelief. "But you had no problem taking everything I had. My future, my chance at buying a house. You didn't even ask, Mom. You just took it, like it was yours to take." She had the nerve to roll her eyes. "Ethan, don't be selfish. Family helps family. You can always save again." I don't think I've ever been so angry in my entire life. I could feel my hands shaking at my sides, my vision blurring at the edges. I had spent years working for that money, sacrificing nights out, vacations, any kind of luxury just so I could finally have something of my own. And now, it was gone, because my mother had decided that Danny's mistakes were more important than my hard work. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm, even though every part of me was screaming to grab something and smash it. "I want it back," I said, my voice deadly quiet. "Every cent." She had the audacity to laugh, like I was some foolish child asking for a toy back. "Ethan, it's gone. Danny needed it, and I helped him. That's what family does. You'll understand one day when you have kids of your own. I felt something inside me snap. In that moment, I knew down to my very bones, that this wasn't just about money. It was about years of being second place, of always being the one expected to sacrifice, while Danny got to live without consequences. It was about my mother never once seeing my worth, never once putting me first. I turned on my heel, walking straight out the door without another word. She called after me, her voice sharp with irritation, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I got into my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they ached, and I made a silent vow right then and there. I was done. Done being the responsible one. Done cleaning up their messes. Done being the expendable child. I would rebuild, but not for them. Never for them. I stood outside my mother's house, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might explode right out of my chest, my hands clenched in a fist at my sides, my breath coming in sharp, ragged bursts that made my lungs burn. I could still hear her voice echoing inside my skull, the casual way she had said it, the way she had just admitted to what she had done as if it was the most natural thing in the world, as if she hadn't just robbed me of everything I had worked for, as if it wasn't a betrayal so deep that I didn't even know how to process it. Danny was in trouble, Ethan. He needed help. That was it. That was all she had to say. Like that explained everything. Like that justified it. Like I was supposed to just nod and understand that. Of course, my future had to be sacrificed at the altar of Danny's never-ending screw-ups. She didn't even look guilty, didn't hesitate, didn't show a single ounce of remorse. Just acted like she had done what any good mother would do, like she was the hero in this situation, like I was the selfish one for even questioning her decision. I had stood there, staring at her, waiting for her to say something else, waiting for some kind of explanation that would make this make sense, waiting for anything other than that same tired excuse I had been hearing my entire life. But she just sipped her coffee, her expression calm, like we were talking about something as meaningless as the weather. I don't think I have ever felt such pure, undiluted rage in my entire life. A kind of anger that burned through me so completely that I could barely think straight, could barely keep myself from putting my fist through the nearest wall, could barely keep myself from screaming at the top of my lungs. This wasn't just about the money. Not really, not when I thought about it, not when I let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened. This was about every single time I had been the one forced to clean up after Danny, every time I'd been told to be the responsible one. Every time my needs had been pushed aside because Danny always needed more, always needed saving, always needed someone to step in and fix his mistakes. You'll be fine. You're responsible. Danny needed it more than you. She had actually said that to me, had looked me in the eye and said it without a hint of shame, without even the smallest hint of understanding how much she had just destroyed me. I had worked my entire life to get to this point, had spent years scraping together every extra dollar, had given up nights out, vacations, anything unnecessary just so I could finally have something that was mine, something that no one could take away from me. But she had taken it, just like that, as if I didn't matter, as if everything I had done, everything I had worked for, everything I had sacrificed was nothing in the face of Danny's endless, pathetic, selfish needs. Family helps family. That was the excuse. The same one she had used every time she had ever bailed him out, every time she had ever excused his failures, every time she had ever expected me to do the same. But where was my family when I needed help? Where was my family when I was the one struggling? Where was my family when I was the one who needed support, needed someone to look out for me, needed someone to put me first for once in my life? Gone. They were gone, just like my savings, just like any illusion I had left that my mother actually cared about me the way she cared about Danny, just like any belief I had held on to that maybe I mattered as much as he did. You can always save again. That was the final nail in the coffin, the moment I knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that there was no coming back from this, that no apology, no excuse, no half-hearted attempt at making things right would ever undo what she had done. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the fact that she had never thought about me, not once, not even for a second, not even long enough to hesitate before she drained my account and handed my future over to Danny like it was nothing. I had wanted to scream at her, had wanted to demand she fix it, had wanted to make her understand just how much she had taken from me. But what would have been the point? She didn't care. She never had, not really, not when it came down to it, not when she had to make a choice between me and Danny. So I did the only thing I could do, the only thing that still gave me any sense of control, the only thing that could keep me from completely losing myself in the rage that was threatening to swallow me whole. I walked away. I turned on my heel, walked out the front door, and didn't look back, even as she called after me, her voice sharp with irritation, like I was the one being unreasonable, like I was the one who had done something wrong, like I was the one who needed to calm down and see reason. I got into my car, slammed the door so hard the whole vehicle shook, and sat there, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white, trying to remember how to breathe. She had stolen everything from me, had shattered whatever was left of our relationship, had made it painfully, brutally clear that I was nothing more than an afterthought to her, that I had never been anything more than that. And now I had a choice to make. I could forgive her. I could swallow the anger, accept what had happened, try to move on, try to rebuild, try to pretend like this was just another bump in the road, just another sacrifice I had to make for the family. Or I could finally be done. I sat there for a long time, staring at the house I had grown up in, at the front door that had slammed shut behind me, at the windows that hid the woman who had just proven, once and for all, that she would never, ever choose me. And then I turned the key in the ignition, backed out of the driveway, and drove away, leaving my mother, my brother, and whatever remained of our family behind me. Because I was done. Done being the responsible one. Done being the expendable child. Done being the one who was always expected to give while they took, and took, and took until there was nothing left. I had spent my entire life trying to be the good son, the one who did everything right, the one who was supposed to hold everything together. But I wasn't going to be that person anymore. Not for them. Not ever again. The first few months after I walked away from my mother's house were some of the hardest of my life. Not just because I had lost everything I had worked so hard to save, but because I had to come to terms with the fact that the people I had spent my entire life trying to please, trying to prove myself to, trying to earn love from, had never really cared about me in the way that I had always hoped they would. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the realization that my mother had never truly valued me the way she valued Danny. That in her eyes, I had never been her priority, that I had always been the one who was expected to sacrifice while he got to live without consequences. That truth was harder to swallow than anything else, and I had to sit with it in ways that made my chest ache, in moments when the bitterness would rise so high in my throat I thought it might choke me. I moved in with my friend Kyle, who had been one of the only people to really understand how much this had broken me, one of the only people who didn't try to convince me to forgive and forget, or tell me that family is family, as if that was supposed to magically erase the betrayal I had suffered. He let me crash on his couch, rent-free for the first few weeks, while I tried to figure out how to pick up the pieces of my life from the wreckage my mother had left behind. I was working double shifts at a job I didn't even like, barely scraping together enough to cover my basic expenses, exhausted down to my bones, and all the while, I had to live with the knowledge that the person my mother had stolen from me to help was out there spending my savings like it was free money, wasting it on things that made my blood boil every time I thought about it. Danny wasn't struggling, not even close. He was living the way he always had, without fear, without caution, without any sense of responsibility for what had been given to him, because he had never had to work for anything a day in his life. He was making reckless investments in things he didn't understand, buying into ridiculous business schemes that he barely had the attention span to research, throwing money at luxuries like expensive watches, overpriced electronics, weekend getaways, and God knows what else, acting like he had earned every cent of it, like he had built that fortune from the ground up instead of having it handed to him on a silver platter at my expense. Every time I heard about something new he had spent it on, it felt like another slap in the face. Another reminder that he had taken something from me that he never even appreciated. Another reminder that I had spent years working and sacrificing just so my mother could throw it all away on someone who didn't give a damn. The worst part wasn't even watching Danny squander the money, though that alone was enough to make my stomach twist with resentment. The worst part was my mother, the way she never once reached out to apologize, the way she never once tried to make things right, the way she spoke about me to the rest of the family like I was the one in the wrong, like I was the selfish one, like I was the one who had betrayed her instead of the other way around. Word got back to me through cousins, old family friends, mutual connections. Things she had said, things she had twisted to paint herself as the victim, to make it seem like I had abandoned her over something so petty, like I was holding a grudge over just money, like I was some cold-hearted son who had turned his back on his own family for no reason at all. It infuriated me in ways I didn't even know how to express, but I refused to let it break me, refused to let her lies define me, refused to let the anger eat me alive. So I did what I had to do. I worked, I saved, I built myself back up from nothing, one step at a time, refusing to let what she had done to me be the thing that kept me down. It took years, 5 of them to be exact, years of grinding, of sacrificing all over again, of throwing myself into something that I could finally, truly call my own. I started my own small business, something I had dreamed about doing for years, but had never been able to take the risk on before. It wasn't easy, and there were months in the beginning where I wasn't sure if I was going to make it, but I fought like hell to keep pushing forward, to build something no one could take away from me this time, to create a future that was entirely mine and mine alone. And eventually I got there. 5 years after losing everything, I was thriving. I had my own place, a business that was finally stable, a life that I had built from the ground up without a single ounce of help from the people who had abandoned me when I needed them most. I had rebuilt what she had taken from me, but more than that, I had finally let go of the illusion that I needed her approval, that I needed her validation, that I needed her love in the way that I once had. She had made her choice, and I had made mine, and for the first time in my life, I was finally at peace with that. And then the phone rang. It was late, almost midnight, and I had been sitting on my couch, winding down after a long day, feeling the kind of satisfaction that came from knowing I had built something worth being proud of. When I saw the number flash across the screen, my stomach tightened instinctively, my fingers hovering over the decline button, because I knew, deep down, that nothing good could possibly come from answering that call. But I did. And the moment I heard her voice, shaking and desperate on the other end of the line, I knew my past was about to come crashing right back into my present, whether I wanted it to or not. The moment I heard her voice on the other end of the line, something inside me tightened, something old and familiar, something I had buried deep beneath years of resentment, something I had convinced myself no longer existed. She sounded different than I remembered, not the composed, indifferent woman who had stolen my future without a second thought, not the self-assured mother who had looked me in the eye and told me that Danny needed it more, not the woman who had dismissed my anger as selfishness and called my pain an overreaction. No, this time, her voice was small, trembling, thick with something that almost sounded like regret, but I wasn't naive enough to believe that it actually was. "Ethan," she said, her breath hitching like she had been crying for hours, like this call was the last thing she ever wanted to make, like she had been forced into a corner with nowhere left to go. "I need your help. We're being evicted." For a long moment, I didn't say anything. I sat there, staring at the wall in front of me, the words swirling in my head like smoke, refusing to settle, refusing to make sense. Evicted. The word itself felt foreign, strange, impossible, like something that couldn't possibly apply to my mother. The woman who had always acted like she had everything under control, the woman who had never once admitted to making a mistake, the woman who had stolen my savings without hesitation because she believed, deep down, that she would never have to face the consequences of her actions. And yet, here she was calling me after 5 years of silence, 5 years of pretending I didn't exist, 5 years of twisting the story to make herself the victim. And now she needed me. Now, suddenly I was worth something to her again. I leaned back against the couch, exhaling slowly, letting the weight of it settle over me, feeling the cold, bitter irony of it creep into my bones. "Now you need my help?" I said, my voice flat, void of emotion, void of anything except the exhaustion of knowing exactly how this was going to go, of knowing that no matter what she said next, it would be some variation of the same old song, the same tired excuses, the same expectation that I would be the one to clean up the mess that she and Danny had made. There was a long pause on the other end, as if she was waiting for me to say something else, waiting for me to offer my sympathy, waiting for me to ask how this had happened. But I didn't. I just let the silence stretch between us until she finally let out a shuddering breath, the kind that told me she knew exactly how little patience I had for this conversation. "Danny, he made some bad investments," she said, her voice fragile, like she was choosing each word carefully, like she was trying to soften the truth so that it didn't sound as catastrophic as it really was. "And he borrowed some money, a lot of money. He thought he could turn it around, but it didn't work out the way he planned." I laughed, the sound sharp and humorless, the kind of laugh that wasn't really a laugh at all, the kind that felt more like a wound splitting open. "You mean he gambled it all away?" I said, not even phrasing it as a question because I already knew. Of course, that's what had happened. Of course, Danny had taken what was left and thrown it into some ridiculous scheme, convinced he was a genius, convinced he could double or triple what he had, convinced that the universe would always bend in his favor, because it always had. She didn't respond right away, which told me everything I needed to know, and when she finally spoke again, her voice was even smaller than before. "I co-signed some of his loans," she admitted, as if it were just a small detail, as if it were just some afterthought, as if it wasn't the single most predictable thing I had ever heard in my life. I closed my eyes, pressing my fingers against my temple, feeling the anger coil inside me like something alive, something with sharp teeth and claws, something that had been waiting years for this moment. She hadn't just given Danny my money. She had kept giving, kept enabling, kept making excuses for him, and now, finally, she was paying the price for it. "You co-signed his loans," I repeated, my voice eerily calm, my mind already picturing the mess she had gotten herself into, already seeing the destruction she had allowed Danny to cause. So now you're in debt. Now, you're losing everything. Yes, she whispered, and for the first time, I heard something real in her voice. Fear. Real, genuine, gut-wrenching fear. I don't know what to do, Ethan. I don't know where else to turn. That was the moment, the precise moment, when I realized exactly what she was asking me for. She wasn't just calling to tell me what had happened. She wasn't just calling to confess. She wasn't just calling because she had no one else to talk to. She was calling because she expected me to fix this. She was calling because after everything, after all the ways she had chosen Danny over me, after all the ways she had justified what she had done, after all the years of silence, she still believed deep down that I would come running. The sheer audacity of it took my breath away. I let the silence stretch, let her sit in it, let her feel for the first time what it was like to need something from someone who had every right to walk away. Ethan, she said, her voice shaking now, desperate in a way I had never heard before. Please, I have nowhere else to go. I almost felt bad. Almost. But then I thought about the years I had spent clawing my way back up from nothing, the nights I had lain awake wondering how I was going to make it, the exhaustion, the anger, the sheer injustice of it all, and the almost disappeared like smoke in the wind. I had a choice to make, a choice that would define who I was going to be, a choice that would answer the question I had been asking myself for 5 long years. Would I help her, despite everything? Or would I let her finally, truly, face the consequences of her choices? The driveway felt smaller than I remembered, the cracks in the pavement spreading like veins, the overgrown grass creeping onto the edges of the worn-out concrete, the once pristine flower beds now tangled with weeds that no one had bothered to pull. I sat in my car for a long moment, staring at the house I had spent my childhood in, the house that had once been a place of comfort before it had become something else entirely, before it had become a symbol of everything I had been forced to leave behind. The windows looked dimmer, the paint on the shutters peeling, the front door hanging slightly crooked on its hinges, like the whole place was sagging under the weight of its own history, like it had been left to rot the same way my mother had let our relationship decay into something unrecognizable. I should have driven away. I should have put the car in reverse, turned around, and left them to deal with the wreckage they had created, left them to fend for themselves the way they had left me to rebuild from nothing. But there was something inside me, something stubborn, something that needed to see this with my own eyes, something that wanted to look them both in the face and make sure they understood exactly what they had done. I needed closure, or maybe I just needed confirmation that I had made the right choice in walking away all those years ago. I stepped out of the car, my boots crunching against the gravel, the wind carrying the sound of a barking dog from a few houses down, the only noise breaking the eerie quiet that hung over the place. As I walked up the front steps, I noticed an envelope taped to the door, the words "Final Notice" printed in bold, red letters that made my stomach twist with something I refused to name. I ripped it off without thinking, scanning the words I had already expected, the official confirmation that the house was being taken, that there was nothing left for them here, that whatever safety net my mother had once believed in had finally disappeared beneath her feet. I didn't bother knocking. I pushed open the door, stepping into the house that now smelled of stale air and dust, the furniture covered in clutter, the living room filled with stacks of unopened mail, empty fast food bags, and old newspapers that no one had bothered to throw away. It was a disaster, a physical representation of the mess their lives had become, a reflection of everything that had unraveled since I had walked away. And yet, somehow, I wasn't surprised. My mother was in the kitchen, hunched over the table, her hands gripping the sides of her head, her shoulders rising and falling with uneven breaths. When she looked up, her eyes were red-rimmed and tired, her face thinner than I remembered, lines of stress carving themselves into her skin in ways that made her look smaller, older, more fragile than she had any right to be. For a split second, something inside me softened, but then she opened her mouth, and the moment shattered. "I made a mistake," she said, her voice trembling, her fingers gripping the edge of the table like she was holding on for dear life. "But I'm your mother, Ethan. That has to mean something." I laughed, the sound bitter and sharp, the kind of laugh that came from years of holding back words I had never been allowed to say. "You're my mother," I repeated, shaking my head as I tossed the foreclosure notice onto the table in front of her. "And what does that mean exactly? That I'm supposed to forget what you did? That I'm supposed to fix this for you? The way I was always expected to fix Danny's messes?" She flinched at that, her lips parting like she wanted to argue, like she wanted to defend herself. But before she could, I heard footsteps from the hallway, slow and dragging, and I knew exactly who it was before I even turned to look. Danny stood there, his hands shoved into the pockets of his wrinkled jeans, his hair a mess, his eyes tired, his face carrying the same entitled, put-upon expression he had worn his entire life. He looked at me like I was a stranger, like I was an unwelcome intruder, like he was still somehow the victim in all of this. And the mere sight of him made my blood boil. "Guess you came to gloat," he muttered, his voice laced with resentment, like I was the one who had ruined his life, like I was the one responsible for his downfall. I turned to face him fully, my jaw tightening, my hands curling in a fist at my sides, the weight of everything pressing down on me like a vice. "Gloat?" I echoed, my voice sharp, filled with a rage I could barely contain. "You think I came here to gloat? You think I give a damn about proving a point? You stole my future, Danny. Both of you did. And now, you expect me to save you?" Danny scoffed, rolling his eyes like he had done when we were kids, like my anger was an overreaction, like my pain was something to be dismissed. "It wasn't my fault," he said, his voice thick with excuses, his hands gesturing wildly, as if waving away any responsibility. "I just had bad luck, man. The market tanked. The investors backed out. The deals fell through. It's not like I did this on purpose. I could have punched him. I could have grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the wall, screamed in his face until he understood, until he felt even a fraction of what I had felt when I checked my bank account that morning and saw nothing but emptiness staring back at me. But instead, I just laughed again, the kind of laughter that had no humor in it, the kind of laughter that held nothing but contempt. "You really don't get it, do you?" I asked, stepping closer, my voice dangerously low, my eyes locked onto his. "You never had to work for anything. You never had to fight for anything. And now, you're finally facing the consequences of your actions. And all you can do is stand here and whine about bad luck." Danny clenched his jaw, but he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. I already knew he would never take responsibility, that he would never truly understand, that even now, when everything had crumbled around him, he would still find a way to convince himself that it wasn't his fault. I turned back to my mother, watching as she buried her face in her hands, her body trembling with silent sobs, and for a brief moment, I felt something like pity. But then I remembered the way she had dismissed me, the way she had never apologized, the way she had told me I could always save again, as if my years of sacrifice had been nothing more than an inconvenience. "I needed you once," I said, my voice steady, my decision already made. "And you turned your back on me?" Her shoulders shook harder, but I didn't wait for whatever excuse she was about to give me. I had heard them all before, and I wasn't interested in hearing them again. I turned and walked toward the door, feeling the weight of the past lift from my shoulders with every step I took. Because this time, I wasn't looking back. The drive back from my mother's house felt like moving through a fog, my mind heavy with the weight of everything that had just happened, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached, my jaw clenched so hard I thought it might snap. The house, the mess, the final notice sitting on the table, Danny's pathetic excuses, my mother's desperate pleading. It all played in an endless loop in my head, like a movie I couldn't turn off, like a nightmare I had already lived through once before, but was somehow being forced to relive all over again. For 5 years, I had told myself that I was done, that I had walked away for good, that I had built a life that had nothing to do with them, that I had freed myself from the weight of being the expendable son, the one who was always expected to give while Danny took and took and took. And yet, here I was sitting in my car, torn between the fury still burning inside me and the small, nagging voice in the back of my mind that refused to be ignored. Because now, for the first time in my life, I was the one in control. I could buy the house right now if I wanted to. I could pay off the debt. I could make the calls. I could swoop in like the responsible son they had always taken for granted and clean up yet another one of their messes. But the thought of doing it made me sick, made something inside me recoil, because this time it wasn't just about fixing things, it was about making a choice that would define the kind of man I wanted to be. Because part of me wanted to watch them fall. Part of me wanted to let the bank take the house, wanted to see my mother lose everything the way she had taken everything from me, wanted to see Danny finally face the consequences of his own stupidity, wanted to walk away knowing that this time, they had no safety net, no backup plan, no responsible son waiting in the wings to bail them out. It would have been so easy. But another part of me, the part one had spent years trying to bury, wasn't so sure. That was how I ended up at Kyle's apartment, sitting on his couch with my head in my hands, staring at the floor while he stood in the kitchen, pouring us both a drink, his silence saying more than any words ever could. He had been there through all of it, through the months when I could barely afford to eat, through the nights when I had stayed awake staring at my bank account, feeling the weight of my mother's betrayal pressing down on me like a stone, through the years of rebuilding, of clawing my way back up from nothing. He had seen the worst of it, had listened to me rage about it, had been the one to remind me, over and over again, that I didn't owe them anything. He handed me the glass, sitting across from me, watching me with the kind of patience that told me he already knew exactly what was on my mind, that he had been waiting for me to say it out loud. "They're losing everything," I finally said, my voice hollow, my fingers tightening around the glass. "The house, the money, everything. She's begging me to help." Kyle exhaled slowly, shaking his head like he couldn't believe I was even considering this, like he had already decided what the right answer was and was just waiting for me to catch up. "And let me guess," he said, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, his expression unreadable. "She didn't apologize. She didn't take responsibility. She just expects you to swoop in and fix it." I looked at him, my throat tightening, because of course he was right, because of course he saw it as clearly as I did, because of course nothing had changed. "She said she made a mistake," I admitted, but the words tasted bitter because they weren't enough, because they had never been enough. "But yeah, she still thinks I should help her. Still thinks that being my mother means she deserves saving." Kyle took a slow sip of his drink, watching me carefully before setting his glass down with a quiet thud. "You don't owe her anything, Ethan," he said, his voice steady, like he needed me to hear it, like he needed to make sure it actually got through this time. "She didn't just take your money. She took your future. She took your trust. She took everything you had spent years building. And now that she's finally paying for it, she suddenly expects you to care." I rubbed a hand over my face, letting out a slow breath, trying to shake the weight pressing down on my chest, trying to make sense of the chaos in my head. "I know," I muttered, hating how conflicted I sounded, hating that I couldn't just shut off the part of me that still gave a damn. "But it's not just her, Kyle. It's the house. It's my childhood. It's everything." Kyle leaned back, his gaze unreadable, his fingers tapping against the glass in his hand. "You really want to spend the rest of your life knowing you bailed her out?" he asked, his voice calm, measured, like he was talking me down from the edge of something I wasn't ready to face. "Do you really want to be the one who saves her after everything she's done? Or do you want to let her finally deal with the consequences of her choices?" I swallowed hard, staring at the drink in my hands, the ice clinking against the sides of the glass, the weight of his words sinking into my skin. "And what if I do nothing?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What if I walk away? What if I let the house go? What if I leave her with nothing?" Kyle didn't hesitate. "Then she learns," he said simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "She learns what it's like to have nothing. She learns what it's like to lose something she actually cares about. And maybe, just maybe, she learns what it's like to be you." I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly, because I already knew what he was saying was right, because I already knew that helping her wouldn't erase the past, because I already knew that no matter what I did, nothing would ever make up for what she had stolen from me. But still, something in me hesitated. I had a decision to make, one that would change everything, one that would determine whether I was the man who let his past define him or the man who walked away and never looked back. And by the time I finally made my choice, I knew there would be no going back. The diner was the kind of place that hadn't changed in decades, the kind of place where the floors were still covered in black and white tiles that had lost their shine, where the smell of burnt coffee and greasy bacon lingered in the air, no matter what time of day it was, where the red vinyl booths were cracked at the edges from years of use, where time seemed to slow down just enough to make you feel like you were somewhere outside of reality. I had chosen it on purpose, not because I had any fond memories of it, but because it was neutral ground, a place where emotions couldn't spill over unchecked, a place where neither my mother nor Danny could slam a door in my face or try to twist the narrative before I even had a chance to say what I needed to say. I arrived first, settling into the booth farthest from the door, giving myself a clear view of the entrance, my hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had probably been sitting in the pot for hours, the bitterness of it matching the taste in my mouth. I had spent the last 2 days going over every possible way this conversation could go, every possible reaction, every possible way they would try to manipulate or guilt-trip me into bending to their will. But this time, I wasn't going to let them twist the story, wasn't going to let them turn me into the villain, wasn't going to let them rewrite history to make themselves the victims of a situation they had created with their own selfishness. The bell above the door jingled, and I glanced up, watching as my mother walked in first, her eyes darting around like she expected this to be some kind of ambush, her hands clutching the strap of her worn-out purse like it was the only thing keeping her together. Danny followed behind her, looking the same as he always had, except thinner, more hollowed out, his usual cocky swagger replaced with something that almost looked like nervousness, like for the first time in his life, he wasn't entirely sure how this was going to go. They spotted me at the same time, my mother letting out a small breath of relief. Danny's face twisting into something unreadable, something I didn't trust, something that made the warning bells in my head go off before either of them had even sat down. Nobody spoke at first. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating, the weight of everything left unsaid pressing down on the table like a physical force. My mother fidgeted with the menu, pretending to read it even though I knew she wasn't actually seeing the words. Danny leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms over his chest, trying to act like he wasn't the one sitting in a booth with his life crumbling around him, like he wasn't the one who had dragged our mother down with him. I took a slow sip of my coffee, setting the cup down carefully before finally speaking, my voice calm, even devoid of any of the emotions I knew they were expecting me to bring to the table. "I'll help," I said simply, watching the way my mother's eyes widened, the way Danny's body stiffened, the way the hope flickered across her face before I crushed it with my next words. "But on my terms. And if you don't agree, I walk away for good." Danny scoffed immediately, shaking his head, already gearing up to fight whatever I was about to say, but I didn't give him the chance. I turned my gaze to my mother, keeping my voice steady, keeping my control iron tight. "Danny is cut off. Forever," I said, watching as she flinched, as she opened her mouth to protest, as she hesitated because she already knew that if she said the wrong thing, she would lose me forever. "If I do this, you don't bail him out ever again. No more loans. No more co-signing. No more handing him money and hoping he changes. He's on his own." Danny let out a sharp breath, his jaw tightening, his fists clenching on the table, but I ignored him, keeping my attention locked onto my mother, waiting for her to make a choice she had never been able to make before. "And you," I continued, lowering my voice just enough to make sure she understood I wasn't playing games. "You sign over all financial control to me. No more accounts in your name. No more making decisions without thinking. If I step in, I take full control, and you do exactly what I tell you. No arguments. No exceptions." The silence that followed was deafening. My mother looked stricken, her lips parting as if she wanted to argue, as if she wanted to beg for a compromise, as if she wanted to find some way around it, but she knew there wasn't one. Danny, on the other hand, didn't even hesitate. "Are you out of your damn mind?" he snapped, leaning forward, his eyes flashing with something almost desperate, something furious, something that told me he knew exactly what this meant for him. "You can't just walk in here and act like you're the one in charge. This isn't your life. This isn't your decision." I turned to him slowly, my expression unreadable, my patience razor-thin. "You made it my decision the second you destroyed her finances," I said, my voice cold, my control absolute. "And now, you don't get a say in how this goes. If you don't like it, walk away. But don't expect a single cent from me. Not now. Not ever." Danny's face twisted, his jaw clenching so tight I thought his teeth might crack, his hands gripping the edge of the table like he wanted to flip it over, like he wanted to scream, like he wanted to throw a tantrum the way he always had when things didn't go his way. But before he could say another word, my mother spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, her hands trembling in her lap. "He stole from me," she said, and the words hit the table like a bomb, like something so heavy it sucked all the air out of the room. I blinked, my head tilting slightly, my heart hammering against my ribs. "What?" She swallowed hard, looking down at her hands like she couldn't bear to meet my eyes. "Danny," she said, her voice breaking. "He stole from me too. Took everything I had left. Lied about the loans. Lied about everything." For a long moment, I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just stared at her, then at Danny, then back again, my mind trying to process the weight of what she had just said, the sheer insanity of it, the sheer audacity of it, the sheer destruction he had left in his wake. And then, something inside me shifted, because this wasn't my problem anymore. I had made my decision, and now it was time to follow through. The air outside the diner felt heavier than it should have, thick with something unspoken, something unresolved, something that settled deep in my chest as I stepped onto the cracked sidewalk, my mother's final words still hanging in the space between us, clinging to the back of my mind like a shadow I couldn't shake. I had spent years convincing myself that I would never be in this position again, that I would never let them pull me back into their chaos, that I would never stand here, torn between the weight of the past and the uncertain pull of whatever future I was about to choose. And yet, there I was, standing at the very crossroads I had spent half a decade trying to avoid, caught between the person I had become and the person they still expected me to be. Danny hadn't followed me outside, which wasn't surprising, considering what had just happened, considering the truth that had finally shattered whatever remaining hold he had on our mother, considering the fact that for the first time in his life, she had looked at him and seen him for what he truly was. I didn't know if that realization meant anything to her, didn't know if it changed anything, didn't know if it was regret or just the slow, dawning understanding that she had tied her fate to a sinking ship, had placed all her bets on the son who had never cared about anything but himself. But either way, it didn't matter, because Danny was beyond saving, and I was finally done trying. The street was quiet, the neon glow of the diner sign buzzing faintly in the background, the hum of passing cars distant and unimportant, the weight of the moment settling in my bones like something permanent, something irreversible. I knew what I should do, knew what the logical choice was, knew that every single person who had ever watched me suffer because of them would tell me to walk away and never look back, to let the foreclosure notice do its job, to let my mother finally experience the consequences of the choices she had made, to let her fall the way she had let me fall all those years ago. And part of me wanted that. Part of me wanted to turn my back on her the way she had turned her back on me, wanted to leave her standing in the wreckage she had built with her own two hands, wanted to walk away knowing that for once, she would be the one left to pick up the pieces. But then, just as I reached my car, just as I gripped the door handle, just as I prepared myself to drive away and leave it all behind, I heard her voice, quiet and broken, barely more than a whisper. "Please, Ethan," she said, and there was something in the way she said it that made my entire body go still, something that sounded too much like the version of her I had once believed in, the version of her I had spent my childhood trying to make proud, the version of her that I wasn't sure had ever really existed. "I have no one else." I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly, feeling the weight of the moment press down on me like the universe itself was waiting for my answer, like this was some kind of test, like the choice I made now would define everything that came after. I could leave. I could drive away and never look back. I could walk away knowing that I had done everything I could, that I had given them more chances than they deserved, that I had spent years trying to be the good son, the responsible one, the one who always did the right thing even when it cost me everything. And no one would blame me for it. No one would tell me I was wrong. No one would call me cruel for refusing to save someone who had never once saved me. But the question that lingered, the question I couldn't escape, the question that wrapped itself around my thoughts and refused to let go, was whether I could live with that choice, whether I could wake up every morning knowing that I had left her with nothing, whether I could carry that with me for the rest of my life without it eating me alive. The next morning, I found myself sitting in a lawyer's office, the smell of old books and stale coffee filling the air, the quiet ticking of a clock on the wall the only sound as I stared at the papers in front of me, the ones that would determine the answer to the question I hadn't spoken out loud, the ones that would decide what kind of man I had chosen to be. The pen felt heavy in my hand, the weight of the decision pressing down on me with every breath, with every passing second, with every unspoken thought that ran through my mind. And then, just as I lifted the pen to the page, just as I made the final move that would seal my fate, the screen faded to black. Because some choices don't come with easy answers. Because some stories don't end with neat resolutions. Because sometimes the real question isn't whether someone deserves to suffer. It's whether you can live with the choice you made.